Okay, I think we should be good right now. I'm trying to make sure that the volume of the mic is not too close to that I'm not too close to it. Otherwise, we start getting feedback. All right, let me just close one window here, and I want to go ahead and open up this window, and then bring this one over here. All right, tonight, Lord willing, we want to take a look at the language of fleeing to the mountains. Fleeing to the mountain. And it's looking at Mark chapter 13, verse 14. We began to talk about that the other day. And I'm kind of glad that we got into this discussion because I think, like everything else, it forces us to go into the Bible to see if there's anything that we can actually learn in addition to what we already know by God's grace. Now, the first attempt or what's been offered is that Mark chapter 13, verse 14, appears to be language of judgment, right? Judgment as if going to the mountains, going to Babylon, where eventually the believers are delivered from Babylon. And what I'm going to try to offer tonight, Lord willing, is that Mark chapter 13, verse 14, is really the language of salvation, right? It has to do with coming out of Babylon. Um, I want to try and establish the setting because I think this, Lord willing, is also important that we see what transpired back in Second Chronicles, the last chapter of the book of Second Chronicles. And also the calendar comes into view because these agree with what we know in history, right? The secular calendar as it ties into the what's been offered by Mr. Camping. And I don't have a problem with that because, as I said, there seems to be a lot of consistency there, provided that we read things in the light of the whole Bible. Now, you see, in 609 BC was when Josiah, he was the last good king to reign over Judah. And he died in battle. And that, I believe, was the beginning of the Great Tribulation. It was typifying the Great Tribulation. And right after Josiah, there were three other kings that began to rule: Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah. And they, in essence, all three of them ruled for a total of 23 years inclusive. Now, in 2 Chronicles 34, verse 33, Josiah took away all the abominations of all the countries that pertain to the children of Israel. And we read that he departed not from following the Lord, the God of their fathers. So I believe that Josiah is really a picture of the last of the good kings. In other words, he was the last of the good kings who reigned over Judah. Everything else that followed after that, it went downhill from there, right? Because God began to judge the nation. And so we see here that Jehoiakim followed after him. Now, granted that, the king of Babylon already, he came into the land of Judah. So he was already ruling. God gave him charge over the nation. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years, and he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, right? Notice here in verse 6, against him came up Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and bound him in fetters to carry him to Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, he was given a charge already he possessed the nation of Judah. Otherwise, you can't go in and begin to raise kings or put down kings. So he's already there. So we read that he carried him to Babylon. And then came Jehoiachin. He was 8 years old when he began to reign, and he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. And we read that in verse 10, Nebuchadnezzar sent and brought him to Babylon with the goodly vessels of the house of the Lord. And he made Zedekiah, his brother, king over Judah and Jerusalem. So Zedekiah comes in. By the way, I have quite a bit of information to share, so we'll try and take a break after each section to see if there are any questions. But I'm trying to see, Lord willing, maybe we'll try to keep this study under an hour. So Zedekiah comes in, right? He was 120 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, right? Humbled not himself before Jeremiah the prophet, speaking from the mouth of the Lord. And we read in verse 14, moreover, all the chief priests and the people transgressed very much all the abominations of the heathen, and polluted the house of the Lord. See, they polluted Judah, they polluted Jerusalem, which he had hallowed in Jerusalem. And then we read a little, I'm just going to share this as an aside, just to show, Lord willing, we can develop this some other time, how God from time to time, he gives sort of like a picture within a picture, right? A picture within a picture, because those who did not go to Babylon, I think, is really pointing to the salvation of the body as they come out of Babylon. Because if they're not going into Babylon, if they're not being taken prisoner, then in essence, it appears that they are coming out of tribulation. Okay, now that's 609 BC, right? So 23 years later is when Judah was actually destroyed. Now you notice the number 23 here, inclusive, right, is consistent, I believe, with the rest of the Bible. God speaks of the tribulation, right? He identifies the number 23 with the Great Tribulation. So tribulation, it seems, already began in 609 BC. In 609 BC. And this is the first 23 years of it, of this tribulation. So we understand then when the people were physically in Babylon, right? When they were physically in Babylon, hey Elizabeth, welcome. They, they were prisoners in Babylon. They were prisoners in Babylon. So the majority, the devastation really has to do with the fact that they were rooted out of their own land. Now they're sitting in Babylon, they're waiting for God to deliver them. So devastation, King Nebuchadnezzar, he took over the city. He set up the kings, he removed the kings, he is taking this king into Babylon, he is taking the goodly vessels into Babylon. So that is already tribulation on the people of God. And verse 19, and they burnt the house of God. Now this is, coming to the final demise of the nation of Judah. They break down the wall of Jerusalem and burnt all the palaces with fire and destroyed all the goodly vessels, right? And then we read in verse 20, and them that had escaped, right, he carried away captive to Babylon. Now, what's important here, Lord willing, as I said, keep in mind that it's not the physical departure that is identifying the nation of Judah with Babylon, but rather the fact that Babylon had already seized the country. He had already seized the nation, right? King Nebuchadnezzar, as God allowed him to go in and destroy the city and take away the vessels. Now, 539 BC, 539 BC, that's 70 years later. So that 70 years is a picture of the entire tribulation, I believe, right? So like parallels the 7 years of famine that came on the land of Egypt when Joseph revealed himself after 2 years, and he typified Christ. So now after 70 years, that's 539 BC, Babylon is conquered by the Medes and the Persians. And that is a picture of the depart out. Okay? It's a picture of the depart out. Now, what's interesting is that Cyrus, right, he typifies Christ, king of Persia. He conquers Babylon, and it was him that God used him to set the decree where the people would now begin to go back to their own land. Mark chapter 13:14, but when ye shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, then let them which be in Judea flee to the mountains. Now I can understand how we can say, okay, now they've come under the rulership of the king of Babylon, and now they have to physically leave after that 23-year period and then go into captivity in Babylon. But can we get the rest of the Bible to confirm that? Especially, we're going to look at in a few minutes that God cut the days short. The days of the tribulation were cut short. So now we begin to see here in verse 21 to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah until the land had enjoyed her Sabbath, as long as she lay desolate. Now remember that she lies desolate for the entire 70 years, which began with Jehoiakim, when Nebuchadnezzar allowed him to become king, and then he did that which was evil, and he was dethroned as well. For as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So that the Sabbath there, again, appears to be identifying with the time that the people of God, they are under affliction. Cyrus the king brought forth the vessels of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had brought forth out of Jerusalem. Now he begins to bring back that which was taken away. And that would have to be, Lord willing, a picture of salvation, a picture of the depart out. We read in Ezra chapter 5, verse 13, but the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, the same Cyrus made a decree to build this house of God. And then God calls him here a shepherd, right? Isaiah chapter 44, verse 28. My shepherd, and Cyrus my shepherd shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. Okay, so we see that the 70 years actually did not begin with the desolation of Judah. The 70 years would have begun when the last good king, that is Josiah, he reigned, and then he died in battle, and now we step into the Great Tribulation. Nebuchadnezzar, he comes into the land, he begins to rule. He is ruling, he is taking things to Babylon, the people, they are being afflicted, and then finally God destroyed Babylon altogether, which I think ties into the death of the church body and where Christ begins to rule. Okay, any questions thus far? Any questions so far? I just want to make sure that at least the timeline, perhaps we get a little bit of an understanding of it. And then I want to move into the fact that the tribulation itself was actually cut short. So that rather than enduring the entire 70 years, as was the case in the historical accounts, God cuts the tribulation short to 2,300 days, right? Matthew 24:22, except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. And then God begins to talk about after the tribulation. Matthew 24:29, those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light. And we're going to see, Lord willing, that even in verse 30, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. So God now begins to gather the believers after the days were cut short, from one end of heaven to the other. And we'll try and tie that in perhaps to the account of Lot and his family leaving Sodom and Gomorrah. And I think we should be able to see there that that too identifies with the revelation of Christ. Okay, now in Daniel chapter 8, verse 13, then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint, how long shall be the vision? Hold on one second. How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot? Now, you have to realize, Lord willing, is that when Nebuchadnezzar came into Judah, the temple there was actually being trodden underfoot. God had already abandoned them. The very fact that he allowed the wicked king to come in and destroy the city, he had already abandoned them. Tony writes, I understand that the captivity is 70 years and that Judah was not destroyed until after 23 years, but only confirms that the destruction of Judah in our day is not the end of the... Well, it is the end of the tribulation. That's why, Matthew 24, after the tribulation of those days, because the days was cut short. So the death of Judah would then have to coincide with the death of the church body. Come out and for my people, right? So, and then we'll see that it ties in, Lord willing, to the 2300 days, which is the 23 years from 609 BC to 587 BC. And that proportion, that ratio, seems to be consistent, even as I said, when we look at the 7 years of the famine that came on the land of Egypt. All right, but hold that thought, Tony. We'll come back to that in a second. Let's try to look at a couple more verses. All right, now in verse 14, and he said unto me, unto 2,300 and, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Now the cleansing of the sanctuary has to be a reference to what? The cleansing of the sanctuary has to be a reference to the depart out, right? God allows the temple to be trodden underfoot, and then it's 2,300 days. We know that because the tribulation is cut short, and if we're looking at the number 23, as I said, that number appears to identify altogether with the tribulation itself. And then we see another reference here in 1 Corinthians 10:8. God is speaking of 2,300 falling in one day, right? The day is the day of the Lord. Now, what's interesting there is that back in Numbers chapter 15, I think, it wasn't 23,000 that fell, it was 24,000. But God, I think, is associating the number 23 with the day of the Lord. And so we can see that going back to 609 BC, the day of the Lord was already in the land. It was already there, the beginning of the Great Tribulation. That's the day of the Lord. But when Christ is actually revealed, then it is the end. That's when Judah is destroyed. That's the revelation of Christ. Now I'm going to see if I can try and share that here in the next section. Lot's wife, right? Is the flight now to the mountains, is that salvation or judgment? Genesis 19:24. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire, and overthrew those cities. Verse 25. Overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities that which grew upon the ground. And now you notice here that God is overthrowing Sodom and Gomorrah. And in Isaiah chapter 13:19 we read, God makes a connection also there with Babylon. Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldees, excellency shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. All right, so God is overthrowing Sodom and Gomorrah, and I believe there is tying it into the destruction of Babylon. But his wife looked back from behind him. Now, is she looking back? Sodom and Gomorrah is a wicked city. All right, I think we'll see that, in the Bible. But are they fleeing a wicked city to go into Babylon? All right, well, before you answer that, let's take a look at Luke chapter 17, verse 28. Likewise, also as it was in the days of Lot. They did eat, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they builded. But the same day Lot went out of Sodom, that would have to be Babylon. It rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even thus, verse 30, even thus shall it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. So the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was typifying the time when Christ is actually revealed. And as I said, Lord willing, that would make sense because God cut the day short for the sake of the elect. And now Christ is on the scene. And now you notice that God appears to be bypassing that additional time that they spent literally or physically in Babylon. I don't think that that's where the substance is. I think the substance begins with the fact that God allowed the wicked king to devastate the land itself. So now, even thus, that is the same way that God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, is the same picture that we're getting here when Christ is actually revealed, right? And just as Joseph, after 2 years, he was revealed to his brothers. So the revelation of Christ here then appears to be a flight out of Babylon, not going into Babylon, because they're just leaving, the Sodom and Gomorrah, which is a wicked city. And I think is typifying the apostasy that had come into the body as a whole. Now, Luke chapter 17, verse 31. Tony writes, could be they went from bad to worse, Lot and his wife. Well, that's what I'm saying, Tony. If you notice that the depart out, God is tying that into the revelation of Christ, right? Even thus, as it be in a day when the Son of Man is revealed. And then he begins to talk about death coming on the church body. Now, there might be other language when we start looking at the Ammonites and so on, but as far as the picture, the tie in there, I think we can actually see this. And now in Luke 17, verse 32, God says, remember Lot's wife. Now, Lot's wife was destroyed, right? She became a pillar of salt. And Christ appears to be saying that in connection with the revelation of Christ, right? When they're actually fleeing Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, what about the resurrection? Resurrection from Sodom. In Revelation chapter 11, verse 8, their dead bodies shall lie in a great city which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt. Sodom and Egypt, right, again, typifying the unclean body in tribulation. That's when the two witnesses are killed. And then we read after 3 days and a half, the Spirit of God entered into them, and they stood upon their feet. So that's salvation. That's salvation. Salvation comes when Christ is revealed. Salvation comes when they're fleeing Sodom and Gomorrah. Right? And as I said, the reason that would make sense, Lord willing, is that if we understand that it's not the physical departure that appears to have been, the substance there, but rather the fact that the tribulation had already begun. Okay, now as I said, I have, I just want to make sure, Lord willing, and I'll offer what it is that I'm seeing, right, based on the information that I've, by God's grace, I've put together. And then we can open for discussion, right, a follow-up on that. But here, when the nation of Israel, right, Judah, when Nebuchadnezzar came into the land, he began to destroy the city. That, because the tribulation had already begun, this would have to tie into the beginning of sorrows. It has to, right? The beginning of sorrows. When God begins to forsake the body. Now, we're going to look at some of these verses leading to Mark chapter 13, verse 14. We'll see here, for nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines and troubles. These are the beginning of sorrows. Now that, I believe, ties in to Nebuchadnezzar already destroying Babylon, right, within that 70-year period. It is the beginning of sorrows. God is hiding his face. He is judging the land. Why? Because the land had become polluted. Take heed, for they shall deliver you up. Now you see the idea of being delivered up in connection with the beginning of sorrows is the time when the city is given to the king of Babylon. Right? The councils, being the scribes, the elders, the judges, the men of renown, I believe. So the believers, they are delivered up. Right? They're going into Babylon. They're in Babylon already. But when they shall lead you and deliver you up, take no thought beforehand what ye shall speak, neither do ye premeditate. Why? Because when they come out of tribulation, God is going to give them the word to speak in that same hour. That's when the Holy Spirit is poured out again a second time, and then the command comes, come out over my people. Now, in Micah chapter 4, verse 10, we're going to look at this verse again, and I want to show some other verses that would seem to explain the nature of going forth out of the city. See, this word here is used about 1,069 times, to be exact, in the Bible. And it could mean anything from salvation to judgment to simply being delivered up, right? As I'm offering here in Mark chapter 13, verse 9 and verse 11. So the rest of the verse here, we read, be in pain, labor to bring forth, O daughter of Zion, like as a woman in travail, for now shalt thou go forth out of the city. Now I know it's the same thing with me if I'm looking at it, right, in the historical account, as when they physically had to leave the city, then yeah, I would tend to understand it like that. But the very nature that King Nebuchadnezzar was already ruling, they had lost the right, they had lost the blessing really God was actually giving them coming into the Great Tribulation. So that's how they are being delivered up, I believe. There shalt thou be delivered. Now in Babylon, we'll see that Judah actually becomes Babylon. Mitchell, hi, welcome. So there shalt thou be delivered. There the Lord shall redeem thee from the hand of thine enemies. And then verse 12, a brother shall betray the brother to death. Now notice here that we're still in pre-depart out, I believe. Pre-depart out. This language, I think, ties into what we saw earlier, right? The body coming under affliction in the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. A brother shall betray the brother to death. How do we know that? Galatians chapter 5, verse 15. But if ye bite and devour one another, take heed that ye be not consumed one of another. And then God goes on to say that ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake, but he that shall endure unto the end. Well, the believers had to endure, right? They endured affliction coming into the Great Tribulation. If ye endure chastening, God dealeth with you as with sons. For what son is he whom the Father chasteneth not? So in other words, the chastening really, when we try to link that to what happened after King Josiah died, God is already afflicting the people. They're already being chastised. Why? Because they're already under the wrath of God. God would not allow the king of Babylon to come and destroy the city if he was not angry with the people, right? So that seems to make sense. Matthew chapter 10, verse 23. When they persecute you in this city, flee ye into another. Now I happen to think again, just as we see that the word would be given to speak, right? The believers, they would be given the word to speak in the same hour. I believe that that hour identifies with the time when they are fleeing to another city. They're not, if they're being persecuted, they're not going to flee to a city or another city where they're going to where they would be persecuted again. But we'll try and develop that in a few minutes. Now, in Daniel chapter 8, verse 13, we begin to see, I think I made reference to this here, the nature of the temple, right? The city being trodden underfoot. 2,300 days. How long shall be the vision? That the city is given into the hand of the king of Babylon already. And then God here, I believe, is telling us 2,300 days. Now, it's interesting that those that are looking at the calendar, that seems to relate. That's why, from time to time, I say that I don't think it's a coincidence that God would have given us the calendar as a guide, as a reference. But once we came to the depart out, then things become spiritual. It becomes very hard to measure time without using the verses in the Bible to interpret what would happen at the very last day. So now we see again, when ye shall see the abomination of desolation standing in a holy place, right? That's the abomination that we read there in the book of Daniel. He said unto me, unto 2,300 days, that's the transgression of desolation. That's King Nebuchadnezzar already destroying the temple. And then let them which be in Judea flee to the mountain. So the big question is, which mountain are they fleeing to now? I propose that it's not going to Babylon, right? For the same reasons that I pointed out earlier, because God seemed to be tying the fact that the days were cut short, and now they're not enduring the full brunt of the tribulation. They were already being afflicted, and now it's a command, I believe, to come out, right? Judah, Judea becoming unclean. That's the next section we'll look at. But let's take a quick break to see if there are any questions for now. I'm sorry if I'm going a little bit too fast. I'm trying not to. I don't want to go too fast because I don't want to go too slow either, because otherwise the study becomes a little bit too long, and it may not necessarily be feasible in terms of keeping your attention. All right, any questions thus far? And looking at, to summarize, Nebuchadnezzar comes into Jerusalem. Tribulation already begins. The people of God, right? Babylon, the king of Babylon, he is taking people out and he is dethroning them. And then now God destroys Judah altogether. And as I offer that seems to be tying in. That seems to be tying into the time when God is actually judging Sodom and Gomorrah. Mitchell writes, "What is spiritual Judah or Jerusalem?" We're going to look at that in the next verse, or the next couple of verses. All right, thank you, Tony. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say that I could see that Nebuchadnezzar was already in the land of Israel pre-destroying Judah. That, I agree with you, points to the beginning of sorrows. But then after the 23 years, when he comes and destroys Judah and the temple, I don't see that as being the end of the tribulation, because he, first of all, in the historical event, they continued another, 46 or 47 years to being under the subjugation of King Nebuchadnezzar, okay? Bringing it over into the New Testament era, in the verses we're looking at in Mark 13, after when the abomination of desolation happens, it the temple's destroyed. To me, it doesn't appear like that's the end of the tribulation, because he says, God tells us in the following verses to flee, because he said this is when the great part of the tribulation is going to go on, and he warns about those that are with child and give suck in those days. Woe unto them. That doesn't sound like the end of tribulation to me, and I can see even in the picture of the historical event that the destruction of the temple was the greatest part of the tribulation for Israel. And I can see that the destruction of the temple in our day would also have to be the greatest part of the tribulation for us. It doesn't seem like we're delivered immediately after the destruction of the temple or Judea. It seems to me like it goes on to describe a certain amount of time that passes before we are delivered. And as we've talked about in other discussions, the actual deliverance, to me, didn't we discuss this, that the actual deliverance of the elect comes when they're gathered from the four winds, when God sends his messengers to gather them from the four winds? Isn't that the deliverance of the elect? Or so when we talk about the tribulation being cut short after the destruction of Judea, and that's the depart out, then why does some time pass and God tells us about great tribulation and some of the things that would happen during that time before he comes and sends the messengers or the angels to gather the elect? That time reference is not being accounted for in the way we're looking at it right now. So, like you say, we have to harmonize everything, so that we would have to look a little bit further into when was the actual deliverance of the elect? Was it at the time the temple was destroyed, or isn't it the deliverance when they're gathered out of the four winds by the messengers? I'll give up the mic.
All right, thank you, Tony. Yeah, we have talked about this a number of times. Great tribulation is not, I don't see that as being separate from tribulation. Tribulation and great tribulation is one and the same. Are you saying that the body is in tribulation today? Because if we're looking at it from the vantage point of the calendar, 2300 days, 88 to 94, 94 being a jubilee, the jubilee has everything to do with the gathering of the people. So that's when the time would have been cut short, right? The jubilee, I believe, identifies with the revelation of Christ. So the 23 years cut short, the 2300 days, that would seem to tie into the whole timeline, the whole schedule. And we see that fraction, that proportion. Yeah, exactly. If we're being gathered, then the tribulation is over. Yeah, the great tribulation is over. That's what I've been, I've proposed this a number of times. Today, the believers, because they are receiving revelation, they are being fed. The unsaved in a body, they're cast into the lake of fire. Right. We don't have a temple today. We're looking at the new temple, Tony. We're looking at New Jerusalem. We're looking at a new body. That's why from time to time I make reference to the old body. Today there's been a separation, and we can't be talking about tribulation today. If the believers are being fed, then spiritually they're not in tribulation. Yeah. So the temple. That's why again I say that the time path, it is a very from everything that I can see, even when you start looking at Daniel chapter 9, you look at the 70 weeks of Daniel 9, that'll bring you right into the Jubilee. Well, what I'm saying is, if we're not in tribulation, that the body has been gathered, right? The body has been gathered. So there's no, so the flight, if the body has been gathered, then the flight that is in view now is not a flight to Babylon again. The command was to come out of Babylon. All right, but like I said, I don't want to make the study too long. I understand your point. Let me share some additional, some other verses, Lord willing, and see if we can try to bring it all together. Um, hold on one second. The temple was destroyed. All right, now what I said is, we have to factor this in. We can't ignore the revelation of Christ in connection with the flight of Sodom, out of Sodom and Gomorrah. I don't think the Bible is teaching that leaving Sodom and Gomorrah is going into captivity, and especially when we tie it into the timing of the Great Tribulation. The Great Tribulation is, I don't see the body being in tribulation. Today, we talk again and again about a separation. All right, Althea, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, evil appears out of the north. Right. I have some of these verses. If you don't mind waiting a little bit, I can get to some of these verses. God speaks of evil coming out of the north. It comes out of Babylon, right, by the great river Euphrates. And that's where God delivers the believers, because coming into the Great Tribulation, when Judah is defiled, then they are in affliction. They're in the Great Tribulation. All right, yeah, let me see if I could maybe share some of these other verses. Otherwise, we may digress a little bit too much, perhaps. Okay, now, Mitchell raised the question, spiritual Judah, Jerusalem. And we understand that, the Judah does not become unclean because she goes physically, right? Because she had to physically go into captivity in Babylon. Judah, Jerusalem, Judea becomes Babylon, right? How does the city sit solitary that was full of people? How has she become a widow? She that was great among the nations and princes among the provinces, how is she become tributary? Tributary, to be under the rulership of someone else. And that was already there in evidence when King Nebuchadnezzar began to destroy Babylon. Now you tie this in to Revelation chapter 18, verse 7. Is that talking about Judah or is that talking about Babylon? How much she have glorified herself. She said, I sit a queen, and I am no widow, and shall see no sorrow. That's the great city. That's the people of God. Jerusalem, Judea, Judah. The faithful city has become a harlot. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 21. How is the faithful city become a harlot? It was full of judgment, righteousness lodged in it, but now murderers. Now you notice the city had already, God began to deal with the nation. Nebuchadnezzar did not destroy Babylon. He destroyed, well, exactly, because Babylon, Judea had become Babylon. See, we can't just look at the historical account. You know, we have to read that in the light of everything else in the Bible. Otherwise, it would be kind of hard to reconcile a number of other things. Take, for example, Moses went up in the mountains. He disappeared 40 years, right? Now, God speaks of cutting the days of the tribulation short, but God did not break down the 40 days and 40 nights. He didn't break it down into that portion of it that relates to pre to part out, because when Moses was finally revealed, when he came down from the mountain, God began a separation, right? So that 40 is identifying with the Great Tribulation. But just because it is, it doesn't mean that it has to be the exact same pattern that has to be followed, at least not from a historical vantage point. We know that the rest of the Bible speaks of the days of the tribulation being cut short. Now, today, if we understand, Lord willing, if we understand that the body is not in tribulation, we've talked about this a number of times. Today, the people of God are not in Babylon. Otherwise, they would not be receiving revelation. They would still be under the authority of the old body. Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 8, her treacherous sister Judah feared not, but went and played the harlot also. God is looking at Judea, Judah, Jerusalem, when they backslide. Be thou right, Nebuzaradan, the captain of Nebuchadnezzar's army, left the weakest people. Yeah, and I pointed to that earlier. You know, there's a picture within a picture that God gives, and I believe the same is true with Lot wanting to go to Zoar, and then eventually went up to the mountains. But that's, Lord willing, we'll have to try and develop that another time. So it wasn't the idea of physically going into Babylon, into captivity. I don't see that that's where the substance is, because otherwise every single, you know, inhabitants of the land at that time, they would have had to physically, right. Yeah, but if you read the language, the residue left in the city were cut off. Yeah, they were cut off in the sense that they were under the king of Babylon. But we read, for example, in one of the verses I offered earlier, that he left some of the poor of the land, right, to be husbandmen. And I think that that's a picture of the body itself again, that does not come under the second death. Oops, hold on a second. Nebuchadnezzar, the captain of the guard, left. Yeah, exactly. Left some of the poor of the land which had nothing in the land of Judah, and gave them vineyards and fields at the same time. Now you see, the language itself in the context is proposing that this is a picture of salvation. So it's not the fact that they had to physically come into the nation. They didn't have to physically be in Babylon really to be in captivity. Okay, hold on one second. I'm going to read your verse. I was trying to post something here and it did not post. I think I posted one part of it. Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 6, flee out of the midst of Babylon and deliver every man his soul. Now, when do the believers flee out of Babylon? When do they flee out of Babylon? After the tribulation. Which tribulation? The one that was cut short. So can you see why it's not that they came into the land and then now they have to that the believers that they have to be going into Babylon? Which mistake? All right, let me try to relate this a little bit. Tony wrote, "Note of this, that the Lord the King that sitteth upon the throne of David, and all the people that dwell in his city, and your brethren that are not gone forth with you into captivity." All right, we'll try and pick up on that a little bit later, Tony. As I said before, I do have some additional things to cover here. Try not to go out of the midst of Jerusalem, not Babylon. Oh, I'm sorry. Flee out of the midst of Babylon and deliver every man his soul. Is that what you're referring to, Althea? Flee out of the midst of Jerusalem. Well, I think there's another verse that relates to that. Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you for, okay, are you saying that it says Jerusalem? Okay, maybe it does. There's another verse here. Maybe I copied it wrong. Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 6. Flee out of the midst of Jerusalem. Hold on one second. I hope I didn't say flee out of the midst of Jerusalem. Okay, now flee out of the midst of Babylon. Hold on one second. That's what I'm trying to. Okay, hold on one second. Let me try to get my get those verses together here. Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 6, I already posted. Now, are you saying that it doesn't read flee out of the midst of Babylon? Okay, well, take a look at this here. Flee out of the midst of Babylon and deliver every man his soul. Be not right, right. That's Babylon. But what about right, right? See, it's not really making a difference whether it's Babylon or Jerusalem, if we understand that Jerusalem becomes polluted, right? We read, for example, in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 17. So in other words, when they're fleeing Babylon, they are fleeing Jerusalem. They're fleeing Judah because King Nebuchadnezzar already had control of the city, right? So spiritually, when we try to tie that into the language of the New Testament, right, and the historical account, we look at Sodom and Gomorrah and how their flight, well, the timing, as I said, we understand that the flight there, right, when Lot and his wife, they're fleeing Sodom and Gomorrah, and God is tying that into the revelation of Christ. So then, and then we look at the tribulation that was cut short. Well, that could only bring us back to the Great Tribulation, right? Babylon is fallen, come out of her, my people. All right, let me see. Let me see if I can. I was trying to avoid having to get too far into this as far as posting verses, because we could digress too much and then. Yeah. All right. Thank you. I appreciate that. Be thou writes, Jeremiah chapter 42, verse 15. Now therefore hear the word of the Lord, ye remnant of Judah. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, if ye wholly set your faces to enter into Egypt and to sojourn there. And even going into Egypt, I believe there also is a picture of coming into Babylon, right? But not the city itself, as I said, because God already began to afflict the people when he allowed King Nebuchadnezzar to destroy the land. Isaiah chapter 3, verse 1, for behold, the Lord of hosts, doth take away from Jerusalem and from Judah the stay and the staff, the whole stay of bread, the whole stay of water. God is removing truth from Judah, from Jerusalem. Why? Because the people are backsliding. It is because they are backsliding that God would actually send Nebuchadnezzar to destroy the city. And really, he is typifying the locust. He is typifying the unsaved in the body, the scorpions, the thieves. They come, they begin to multiply in the city, right? And that's how the city becomes further and further polluted. Isaiah chapter 52, verse 9, break forth into joy, sing together, ye waste places of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is laid waste. When they come out of Jerusalem, they're breaking into joy, right? They're breaking forth into joy. And that has to be the language of salvation. Rejoice, ye heavens, and ye that dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth. Is a time there, I think, Lord willing, we'll see in the book of Revelation. Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 20, declare this in the house of Judah, and publish it in Judah, saying, Where is the other part of that verse? Okay, verse 21. Hear now this, O foolish people, and without understanding, which have eyes and see not, which have ears and hear not. As a cage that is full of birds. Now, this language I think is very interesting, because that's the same language we pick up in the book of Revelation when God is talking about the judgment that comes on Babylon, right? Babylon is fallen because she has become the habitation of devils and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. Now you see how God is tying this language in connection with Jeremiah chapter 5, verse 20. It is Judah, it is Jacob, that is a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. And then in Revelation chapter 18, it is Babylon. So it's not really two distinct. I'm not seeing it as two distinct entities. The two become one. No, Tony, I disagree. I disagree. And, this is one area that, Lord willing, some of us, even some of the other guys, they had gotten it correct for some reason. It is Babylon is, God allows Babylon to come in. Babylon had nothing to do with the nation of Israel. They were not part of the people of God. But that is in the historical account. But when God allows the locusts, the thieves, to come into Judah and Jerusalem, well, then the city itself then becomes Babylon. Why? Because they become inhabited by the locusts, by the unsaved, by the unclean in the body, that God is actually using to destroy Jerusalem. So when he speaks of Babylon, he is talking about his own people that has fallen away. He is talking about the abomination of desolation. Exactly. Babylon is typifying, I believe, the locusts. These are the thieves. How is God going to destroy Jerusalem? Well, yeah, they fall away, right? They begin to backslide, and then it's because of that God allows them to go further and further into rebellion. But I think we'll see that. Hold on one second. Lord willing, we'll begin to see this a little more. Revelation 18, verse 4. And then we read, come out of her, come out of who? Come out of Babylon. Judah is gone into captivity. She dwells among the heathen. Why? Because God is judging her. Lamentations chapter 1, verse 3. Judah is gone into captivity because of affliction and because of great servitude. So in other words, the people begin to backslide. God is not going to be idle. God now brings the locust. He brings the thieves. He brings the scorpion. Those that they begin to bring a false gospel, they identify corporately with the kingdom, right? And now they become a part of the kingdom. They're dwelling in the midst. And so therefore, God can refer to the whole body now as being Babylon, right? It is a harlot committing fornication. Lamentations chapter 1, verse 4, the ways of Zion do mourn, because none come to the solemn feast. Her gates are desolate, the gates of Zion. Why? Because Babylon, God is using Babylon to destroy the city. So when God is talking about come out of her in the book of Revelation, exactly, that's to depart out. That's to depart out. Come out of her, my people. Now God is going to bring, he is avenging the blood of the martyrs. Who killed the martyrs? The unsaved in the body. Come out of her, my people, because God now is bringing vengeance on Babylon. And this ties into the destruction of Judah. Right. All right. Hold on one second. What I'm offering here again is that, if we're looking at Judah, Judea, Babylon, and not considering that it becomes one entity. That's the church body. That's the unsaved body. That altogether now God is destroying. Come out of her, my people. Right? Come out of who? Come out of the unclean. Because God now is going to bring a clean out of an unclean. Oops, hold on one second. I just had a verse that I may have to bring. Actually, this is the verse that I was talking about earlier. Let me see if I can expand on this just a little bit longer. Go forth out of the city, right? Be thou in pain and labor to bring forth, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in travail. And a woman in travail, as we've talked about before, again, is pointing to the whole body coming into the great tribulation. The body is experiencing the birth of childbearing or childbirth, right? Coming into the great tribulation. When does the woman deliver? When she comes out of Babylon, right? She brings forth a man child. But thou shalt go forth out of the city. And as I said before, this term here, it is used over 1,000 times. And some of the verses that might relate, Jeremiah chapter 38, verse 23. So they shall bring out all thy wives and thy children to the Chaldeans. Right? Now that, I believe, is pointing to the time when God allowed King Nebuchadnezzar again to come into the city. They are actually being delivered up to the king of Babylon. He is ruling over them. So they shall bring out all thy wives and thy children to the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans is another name for Babylon, right? In Chaldea. Lamentations 1 verse 6, from the daughter of Zion, all her beauty is departed. Well, when is the beauty departed? When God hides his face from the whole church body. When does that take place? At the start of the Great Tribulation. Right? We read some of those verses in the book of Ezekiel. I will hide my face from them. In a little wrath I hid my face from thee. When would God have hidden his face from Jerusalem? Not when they literally went into Babylon. No, well, they go into Babylon, Tony. What I'm offering is that not when they physically go into Babylon. God is hiding his face at the time that Josiah, the last good king, actually died in battle. So he would have typified the faithfulness, more or less. We know the wheat and the tares were growing together. No, I'm afraid that that's not what I'm seeing, Tony. That's not tying into the timing, as I pointed out earlier, the resurrection of the two witnesses coinciding with the believers coming out of Sodom. Zechariah chapter 2, verse 7, deliver thyself, O Zion, that dwellest with the daughter of Babylon. They're dwelling together, right? Isaiah chapter 48, verse 20, go ye forth of Babylon. Now you see, to say that Babylon today, somehow we've come into Babylon, that would indicate that there is tribulation, that the body is still in tribulation. But yeah, we've talked about this a number of times, that today God is separating the wheat from the tares. And that would have identified with when Cyrus, king of Persia, came and God gave him the charge to conquer Babylon. God is the one who conquers Babylon. He destroys the thieves, the locusts. They are the ones who kill the two witnesses, right? Typified by King Nebuchadnezzar coming into the land. Isaiah chapter 52, verse 11, depart ye, go ye out from thence, touch no unclean. What is the unclean? Well, it is the Chaldeans. It is Babylon, right? It is Babylon. We come out of Babylon only after the temple in Judah. Exactly. I'm not saying anything different. The temple has been destroyed, Tony. That's where we are today. There's a separation. We are past the tribulation. So the temple has been destroyed. And if we consider that God had shortened the days, then Lord willing, we realize that it ties into the revelation of Christ. As I pointed out earlier, when Lot and his wife were fleeing, they were leaving Sodom at the same time when Christ is actually revealed. All right, we're almost done, Lord willing. The mountains could be used both in the context of judgment as well as salvation. But you see, the context really has to determine Because we also read about those who, they flee to the mountains, saying to the rocks or to the mountains to cover them, to fall on them. That, I believe, is identifying when Christ is actually revealed to judge the body. There are those that they continue, they are like Lot's wife. They continue to, their trust is not the rock that is Christ, but they are still under the wrath of God, right? Today, I believe we are in the 5 months when men are seeking death and they are not finding it. Well, the 5 months is after the tribulation. It has to be after the tribulation. Now, unless we say, oh, okay, well, I have no interest in looking at the pattern of the calendar, well, then we have to account for what happens in the year of Jubilee. We have to account for Daniel chapter 9. When we look at the 70 weeks, how does that tie into the Great Tribulation? And especially when God says that he cut the tribulation short. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills from whence cometh my help. The help comes from God. When the believers are redeemed, when Babylon falls, when Judah falls, I believe it's a time when the body is fleeing to Christ. They are being redeemed. God is redeeming the body. And that would tie in, again, as I said, with the resurrection of the two witnesses. During that time, 3.5 days, their body lies in a great city that is spiritually Sodom and Egypt. And if God is destroying Sodom, he is destroying Egypt, he is destroying Babylon, well, that's the time when the believers are coming to be fed, right? Now you notice here Isaiah chapter 2, verse 3, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord. Why? Because there he will teach us of his ways. The believers receive the word to speak in the same hour. God is teaching them. Why? Because they've come up to be with him in the mountain. Today the believers are keeping the Feast of Tabernacles. Ye shall flee to the valley of the mountain, for the valley of the mountain shall reach unto Azel. And now, we read about a great earthquake, and we know that identifies with the great day of the Lord. So wouldn't it make sense that the believers are fleeing from the earthquake because God is redeeming them? They're not coming under the judgment of God. Mark chapter 3, verse 13. And as I said, if I'm going a little bit too fast, I try to highlight these verses here, the key points. So hopefully that might relate to the point that I'm sharing here. Ezekiel 7, verse 16, they that escape of them shall escape and shall be on the mountains like doves. Who are they that escape? Well, the believers escape. What is it that they're escaping from? They're fleeing from Babylon. They're fleeing from Judea that has become Babylon. Why? Because God has cut the days of the tribulation short. The rich man today, the unsaved in the body, they are under the wrath of God. Whereas the believers, they happen to be in Abraham's bosom. And I think spiritually that too is pointing to the fact that they've come to be with Christ in the mountains. Ye are come unto Mount Zion, unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. Hebrews 12:18. Fear ye not, come unto the mount for ye are not come unto the mount that might be touched, that are burned with fire, nor unto blackness and darkness and tempest. Right? There is a mountain that identifies with God's judgment. Exactly. Well, yeah. Did I post that verse? I think I know which one you're talking about. But they that escape of them shall escape, and shall be on the mountains like doves of the valleys, all of them mourning, every one for his iniquity. Okay, yeah. All right, thank you. As a matter of fact, thank you, Alfie. I have to double check that. I'm not sure if right. That's what I'm just noticing now. of the valley, all of them mourning, everyone for his iniquity. Well, actually, yeah, I think it does identify. You know why? Because God speaks of the time when the believers, they after God brings them out of Babylon, He brings them out of tribulation, they are actually in sackcloth, right? Because I can't think of the exact verse right now. So yeah, I do think that might be pointing to salvation. They that escape of them shall escape and shall be on the mountain like doves of the valleys, all of them mourning. Yeah, they're mourning not because they're under the wrath of God, they're mourning for their iniquity. I think there's some verses that would support that, Lord willing. Okay, Revelation chapter 14, verse 1. And I looked, and lo, a lamb stood on the Mount Zion. See, that's where the believers, I believe, they've come to when God cut the days of the tribulation short, right? They come to Mount Zion. They come to be with Christ. They come to be fed because now God has delivered them from what? From Babylon, from the locusts, from the thieves. They're delivered from Judah that had become Babylon, right? The abomination of desolation was standing in the holy place, and now they had to be removed. They had to come out. Well, that's what I was explaining to Althea just now, Tony. There are some verses. Yeah, right. There are some verses that would tie into that, where they actually mourn, not because they're being afflicted, but because they recognize their sin. They recognize their sin. And as soon as I can think of the exact reference, I think it's in the book of Ezekiel. But you notice that they are the ones that escape, right? They are the ones that escape. Now, because they recognize God's judgment, God's hand was upon them, and so now they are in sackcloth and ashes. They mourn everyone for his iniquity, not a mourning that identifies with coming under judgment, but the fact that they recognize that God had brought them into the time of judgment. And I'll see if I can try to relate that in a little bit. Isaiah chapter 13:13. Therefore I will shake the heavens, the earth shall remove out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts, and in the day of his fierce anger. And it shall be as a chased roe, as a sheep that no man taketh up. They shall every man turn to his own people, and flee every one into his own land. What does that identify with? Leviticus 25, right? The time of Jubilee. That's the time when every man returns to his own land. What land? New Jerusalem. That would tie into Cyrus, king of Judah. The king of Persia, when God gave him command to bring the people out of captivity. Jeremiah 49, verse 30. Flee, get you far, dwell deep, O ye inhabitants of Hazor. For the king of Babylon have taken counsel against you, and have conceived the purpose against you. So they have to flee because Nebuchadnezzar, right, Satan, he is ruling in the midst of the people. Therefore, the flight, now this is judgment, right, given the context, the flight shall perish from the swift, and the strong shall not strengthen his force, neither shall the mighty deliver himself. The unsaved in the body. Remember, Christ speaks of a strong man, and then he speaks of another that is stronger than he. Those who believe that they have their own strength, ultimately they come under the wrath of God. They do not experience the resurrection. They do not experience the flight into the kingdom of God. They do not come up to Mount Zion. God is not feeding them there. So there is no flight for them. Jeremiah 31, verse 6. For there shall be a day that the watchmen upon the Mount Ephraim cry, Arise, ye, and let us go up to Zion. Right? Unto the Lord our God. John chapter 10, verse 5. And a stranger will they not follow, but will flee from him. Well, who is the stranger? The stranger would have to be the enemies of the body, the locusts, the king of Babylon, the unsaved, anyone who is under God's judgment today. But these are the ones that the believers that they're fleeing from. They're leaving Babylon. They're leaving the unclean behind. flee fornication. Well, Babylon, we know, is fornicating. Judah is fornicating. Now the believers, they have to come out of that fornication. Wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. And then we know that in Revelation chapter 12, I think this is the last verse, hold on. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she have a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. And I believe that again, that's a half of 7. That's post-tribulation. Right? It would have to be identified with the 5 months as well. So there is judgment. Those that are seeking death, they're looking for salvation, they're not finding it. Whereas the believers, they are fleeing to the mountains, they're going to be with Christ, they're going into the wilderness, and God is feeding them. Now, the other picture, as I said, God appears to bring the whole body, right? Just like the children of Israel when they came out of Egypt. God brings the whole body into the wilderness, and then he speaks of, he continues to purge the body, right? He continues to purge the body. And we'll see this, for example, and I'm not going to get too far into it tonight, Lord willing. Maybe we can talk about it another time. But that there, again, I think is pointing to what's going on today. All right, so looking at the overall picture, this is what I'm offering. It appears that fleeing to the mountains, which we read in Mark chapter 13, 14, is the language of salvation. I do not see the Bible to be pointing to that right now as judgment. We're not fleeing an unclean to go into another unclean. That would be judgment. But we're fleeing something that is unclean to go into the mountains to be with Christ. Right? So elect body coming into the great tribulation is the beginning of sorrows, where Judea, Judah, Jerusalem, they have become the abomination of desolation. So God, it seems, can also use the mountains to relate to judgment depending on the context. And that's what I was saying just now. Corporately, he speaks of a salvation of the body, right? And we know that many people, they have knowledge, they have some kind of understanding of the nature of the time, the death of the church body. But we don't know for sure. I mean, we can't tell just because perhaps someone came out of the church that they somehow they've obeyed the command to come out of Babylon. For some reason I thought I'm hoping that I posted all the verses that I had here. I may have missed, forgive me if I missed some verses where I would have maybe need to elaborate on a little bit. But as I said, I'm offering that when we look at the nature of the time, the timing of the Great Tribulation, even in the historical account, which ties in to the calendar. Today, there's no way that I think we can say that somehow there is tribulation or even great tribulation on the unsaved body or even on the believers. I think today we're looking at the rich man and Lazarus, the rich man under the wrath of God, crying for a drop of water, begging, but in reality, today men are seeking death, they're not finding it. And all because, again, as I said, I believe that God had shortened the days so that the day of the Lord came as a thief in the night, and it is judgment. Okay, just give me 1 second.